From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Que haya justicia, más que nada, más que nada.
I would want that above all else, justice be done, that these assailants be arrested, because it's not possible for them to be allowed to go on killing like it's nothing. They have no respect. 6-year-old children are traumatized because the way my husband was killed, where he was, where we all were, how it was done.
46 journalists were killed this year. Some were covering war, others murdered in retaliation for their reporting. Another 20 were killed under unconfirmed circumstances. Few, if any, of the murders have been solved. Meanwhile, a record 262 journalists were imprisoned around the world, with Turkey, China, and Egypt topping the list for the second year in a row. We'll look at the 25th annual survey by the Committee to Protect Journalists and get an update on the case of award-winning Mexican journalist Emilio Gutierrez Soto, fighting his deportation from a U.S. detention center in El Paso after receiving death threats for reporting on alleged corruption in the Mexican military.
It would appear that I would need to enter the United States with bullet holes on the front and back of my body, or mutilated, which is what the institutional criminal group, the Mexican government, generally does.
Emilio Gutierrez Soto was honored by the National Press Club in October. Last week, its executive director visited him in detention, along with Texas Democratic Congressmember Beto O'Rourke. We'll speak with the National Press Club's executive director, Bill McCarran, and play an excerpt of our jailhouse interview with Emilio. But first, Homeland Security goes abroad. Not everyone is grateful. A New York Times investigation reveals how the Department of Homeland Security has thousands of DHS and TSA agents stationed in more than 70 countries around the world, some countries accusing the U.S. of trying to export Trump's travel ban. We'll speak with New York Times reporter Ron Nixon about the story. And during this busy travel season, we'll look at how a $1 billion airport facial scanning program could violate the privacy of travelers on flights from Boston, Las Vegas, Miami, New York's JFK, Washington, Dulles, both Houston airports, Chicago, O'Hare, and Atlanta. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The state of Alabama has officially declared Democrat Doug Jones the winner of the highly controversial U.S. Senate race 2 weeks ago. On Thursday morning, a judge blocked the lawsuit of Jones' rival, Republican Roy Moore, who was claiming voter fraud and demanding a new election. This is the Alabama Secretary of State, John Merrill.
I would hope that Judge Moore would look at what we have done, and if he chose to have a personal conversation with me, I'd be happy to explain to him, as I have to you and many other people that are outside the sound of my voice right now, about what our process and our procedures are, because I don't think there's anybody has a doubt. If they've been objective and they have looked at this, then they know what has occurred is legitimate.
African-American voters helped propel Doug Jones to victory by more than 20,000 votes over Moore after at least 9 women accused Roy Moore of sexually harassing or assaulting them when they were teenagers, one as young as 14 years old. As a record-breaking cold spell continues to freeze parts of the Northeast and Midwest United States, President Trump took to Twitter to try to use this week's cold weather as an opportunity to cast doubt upon many decades of scientific evidence of global warming. Trump tweeted, quote, "In the East, it could be the coldest New Year's Eve on record. Perhaps we could use a little bit of that good old global warming that our country, but not other countries, was going to pay trillions of dollars to protect against. Bundle up," Trump tweeted. Scientists roundly refuted and ridiculed Trump's tweet, with one climate scientist calling it an ignorant misconception. President Obama's U.S. climate change envoy, Todd Stern, responded, quote, "Of course it sometimes gets very cold. 5 minutes worth of education would tell you that what matters are global averages, and those are going implacably up," unquote. California Congressperson Ted Lieu condemned Trump, tweeting, quote, either real Donald Trump doesn't understand the science behind climate change or he's intentionally misleading the American people, unquote. The record-breaking cold has smashed temperature records in parts of the United States, including in International Falls, Minnesota, where the temperature hit a record 37 degrees Fahrenheit below zero earlier this week. The Trump administration slated to roll back safety regulations for offshore drilling that were implemented after the 2010 Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, which killed 11 people and caused the most devastating oil spill in U.S. history. The Interior Department, under Secretary Ryan Zinke, is considering a proposal that would scrap the Obama-era regulations for blowout preventers, which are intended to prevent explosions in undersea oil and gas wells. The department claims the deregulation would save the oil industry more than $200 million over a decade. Environmental groups widely oppose the rollback of the rules. The Center for Biological Diversity said, quote, reversing offshore safety rules isn't just deregulation, it's willful ignorance, unquote. President Trump complained about special counsel Robert Mueller's ongoing investigation into whether the Trump campaign colluded with Russia, telling the New York Times during an impromptu interview Thursday at Mar-a-Lago that the investigation, quote, makes the country look very bad and it puts the country in a very bad position, unquote. During the interview at Trump's International Golf Club, Trump also claimed 16 times that there had not been any collusion between his campaign and Russia. Russia's accused the United States of breaking an arms control treaty by selling 2 missile defense systems to Japan. Russia's accusation comes after Japan said it would buy 2 of the U.S. missile defense systems amidst rising tensions in the region over North Korea's nuclear program. This comes as Russia has also accused the United States of interfering in Russia's upcoming presidential election after the U.S. condemned Russia's decision to ban opposition candidate Alexei Navalny from running. In New York City, at least 12 people have been killed and 4 more critically injured after a fire broke out in an apartment near the Bronx Zoo. It's the worst fire in New York City since 1990. This is New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio.
This is the worst fire tragedy we have seen in this city in at least a quarter century. Based on the information we have now, this will rank as one of the worst losses of life to a fire in many, many years. At this moment, based on preliminary information, and again, there will be more information coming in the next few hours, but based on the information now, I'm very sorry to report 12 New Yorkers are dead, including 1 child as young as 1 year old.
Meanwhile, in India, at least 14 people have been killed and 50 more injured after a fire tore through a restaurant in Mumbai early Friday morning. One of the survivors said the fire engulfed the restaurant in a matter of seconds. Criminal charges have now been filed against the restaurant's owner over the lack of adequate emergency exits and evacuation instructions. In Yemen, the United Nations says 2 U.S.-backed Saudi-led airstrikes Tuesday killed at least 68 civilians, including 8 children. One of the airstrikes hit a crowded market in the southwestern province of Taiz. The second strike hit a farm in western Yemen, killing 14 members of the same family. In Syria, about a dozen critically ill patients have been evacuated from eastern Ghouta, a suburb of Damascus. Eastern Ghouta has been besieged by Syrian government forces since 2013. The majority of the critically ill patients evacuated this week are children. There are currently about 400,000 civilians living there, where supplies of medicine, food, and water are dwindling. Meanwhile, in more news on Syria, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan denounced Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad as a terrorist mass murderer and said there's no place for him in a post-conflict Syria. Erdogan's comments Wednesday represent a shift away from the softer stance Turkey has taken toward Assad in recent years. In the West African country of Liberia, supporters of ex-footballer George Weah celebrated his presidential election results showed him far ahead of his rival Vice President Joseph Boakai. The former football star will now succeed Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was the first woman elected head of state in Africa. This year's election marks the first peaceful transition of power in Liberia since 1944. A 16-year-old Palestinian girl will face assault charges in an Israeli military court after a video of her slapping an Israeli soldier went viral. Ahed Tamimi slapped the Israeli soldier 2 weeks ago after Israeli troops shot her 14-year-old brother in the head with a rubber-coated steel bullet and fired tear gas canisters into her family's home in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. While the video of Tamimi slapping the soldier has gone viral, Mondoweiss reports the soldier actually slapped the 16-year-old girl first, causing her to slap back. This is Tamimi's father, activist Bassem Tamimi.
The other issue is the support of people and a nation who saw through the slap of Ahed as a morale. They saw their own will, their aspiration, their desire in this second to slap the occupation. It expressed the spirits of the Arabic, Palestinian, and human street who desire at some point to erupt against the reality of injustice in a moment of being broken.
Back in the United States and Pennsylvania, Professor George Ciccariello-Maher has resigned from Drexel University after receiving months of death threats and online harassment by white supremacists and right-wing media outlets. Ciccariello-Maher faced the torrent of criticism for tweeting about white supremacy, the U.S. military, and how Trumpism was helping fuel the high numbers of mass shootings carried out by white men across the United States. This is Ciccariello-Maher speaking after suspected shooter James Paddock, a 64-year-old white man, killed 59 people, including himself, in that mass shooting in Las Vegas in October.
I think this is a question that we all need to grapple with. When you see these cases of sort of just shocking mass brutality, what is it that makes white men so prone to this kind of behavior, and what might be going on today in our country in which people are stoking a sort of victim complex among white men? What might be happening today to encourage this kind of behavior and to radicalize these kind of actions? And I was immediately subject to a torrent of sort of abuse and threats from, right-wing media outlets.
This fall, George Ciccariello-Maher was banned from campus after speaking out about the mass shootings in a move Drexel said was for the professor's own safety. On Thursday, Ciccariello-Maher wrote on Facebook that his situation was unsustainable and, quote, staying at Drexel in the eye of this storm has become detrimental to my own writing, speaking, and organizing, he wrote. And in New York City, anti-police brutality activist Erica Garner has suffered major brain damage following an asthma-induced heart attack over the weekend. While some news outlets reported on Thursday she was brain dead with no chance of recovery, Erica's family members rejected those accounts, saying they're still holding out hope and that the doctors have registered some brain activity. Erica has helped lead the struggle for justice for her father, Eric Garner, who was killed when police officers in Staten Island wrestled him to the ground, pinning him down, applying a fatal chokehold in 2014. His final words, "I can't breathe," which he repeated 11 times. In August, Erica Garner gave birth to her second child, a boy named after her late father. Doctors say the pregnancy strained her heart. This is Erica Garner speaking on Democracy Now! Last year.
Well, when you deal with grief, when you talk about grief and you talk about family and how regular families deal with it, families have problems. Family has trouble with coping with it, but it makes it so different because now we are part of this national scale. I still haven't accepted that my father is gone, even though I talk about my dad, but I talk about him in a case study. Like, I've been studying this case. For the latest updates, you could go to my website or to Twitter, officialericagardner.com or officialerica on Twitter. And, you can see I'm constantly reading articles and doing the research on my dad's case, but I'm not taking care of me.
To see all of our interviews with Erica Garner, you can go to democracynow.org. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show with a new investigation that reveals how the Department of Homeland Security is increasingly going global, with thousands of agents from the Department of Homeland Security and the Transportation Security Administration stationed in more than 70 countries around the world. hundreds more DHS workers are deployed at sea on Coast Guard ships or in the skies on surveillance planes. Stationing ICE overseas is reportedly about 4 times as expensive as a domestic post. Now, some countries are accusing DHS of attempting to export the United States' restrictive immigration laws, with one German politician saying DHS's interrogations and detentions at foreign airports constitute an extrajudicial travel ban. Andre Hunko, a member of the Germany Left Party, accused the United States of moving its immigration controls to European countries. Well, for more, we're joined in Washington, D.C. by the journalist who broke the story for the New York Times. Ron Nixon is the New York Times Homeland Security correspondent. His piece is headlined, "Homeland Security Goes Abroad. Not Everyone is Grateful." So, Ron, tell us what you found.
Oh, good morning, Amy, and thanks for having me on the show. The article is just about the global footprint of the Department of Homeland Security, and the reason that they're going to these countries is to attack whatever threats, be they terrorist threats, be they human traffickers or human smugglers, or international criminal organizations at the source. So they've stationed these people abroad. As you mentioned, there are about 2,000 from ICE agents to TSA to Customs and Border Protection to the Secret Service that are stationed in about 70 countries. In addition, there are people on Coast Guard cutters that are sailing around thousands of miles away, and Customs and Border Protection obviously, again, has these surveillance planes that fly primarily off the coast of South America and the Caribbean Sea looking for drug smugglers. But the biggest thing is that those are just the people that are permanently in these places. There are employees from the Department of Homeland Security who are deployed on a temporary basis and training and doing investigations and a number of other activities in these countries. And as you mentioned, there is some pushback from some countries who feel as though that they're a little uncomfortable with having U.S. law enforcement on their soil, and particularly some of the European countries.
Can you talk about, well, you just flew in from Canada earlier this morning, Ron, where more than 400 Homeland Security employees are stationed. In your investigation, you reported Canadians flooded their prime minister's office in August with letters and emails protesting legislation to allow U.S. Customs officers stationed at Canadian airports and train stations to question, search, and detain Canadian citizens. Unnamed government officials told the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation the volume of mail received was unprecedented and took officials by surprise. This measure ultimately passing earlier this month?
Yes. So there's a program called pre-clearance that has existed in Canada since 1952. And essentially what it is instead of going through customs once you land in the United States, you go through customs there. So Customs and Border Protection has customs officers stationed at Canadian airports, about 8 of the, I believe it's about 8 Canadian airports, and you clear customs there. So when you land in the U.S., you're basically a domestic passenger. Increasingly, though, this program has been seen as a counterterrorism program to stop people from coming to the U.S., and so you don't have to deal with them once they're here. You deal with them abroad. This bill in Canada, C-23 is the name of the bill that just passed. Before, if you were a Canadian citizen and you went to pre-clearance and you decided, I don't like the questioning, so I'm just going to leave, you could just leave, and there's nothing that the customs officers, U.S. Customs officers, could do. Under this new legislation, they can question you. They can even detain you. They can't arrest you, but they can detain you if there's something, and they can detain you until the Canadian law enforcement officials get there. So there was, as you referenced, there was outcry from people who were saying, well, why are we letting U.S. law enforcement officers do this on Canadian soil to Canadian citizens.
Can you talk about the number of ICE agents who are abroad?
Yes, there are about 300 ICE agents that are abroad in about 50 different countries. And these are primarily people from Homeland Security Investigations, which is a part of ICE. It's the investigative wing of ICE. And what they do is target transnational criminal organizations. They do visa security investigations for people who are applying for visas to come to the country. They'll background those people, do investigations to make sure that they're not terrorists or human smugglers. So that's essentially what those folks are there. Again, the purpose is to attack the problem at its source rather than waiting for it to come to the U.S.
The concerns about DHS agents being placed abroad when a number are needed at ports in the United States?
Yes, so the union that represents customs officers is saying that there's a shortage of customs officers at the ports of entry. There are more than 300 ports of entry here in the United States. And so the union that represents these officers is saying, well, before you talk about sending more people abroad, let's make sure that we have the people here to actually make sure that, we can make sure that drugs don't come into the country or that other threats don't make it through the ports of entry. Because, if you look at the DEA drug reports, the majority of drugs that come into this country actually come through the ports of entry.
You write about a situation in Tanzania where ICE investigators were accused in May of using mafia-style tactics. What happened?
So there was this international drug organization that was based out of Tanzania, but also operated in South Africa. And the leader of it, they sourced heroin from Pakistan and from Afghanistan, got cocaine from South America and sold it internationally. And one of their members was caught at Houston Airport, one of the Houston airports, smuggling heroin. And so ICE has jurisdictions over any type of international crime that crosses the border. This guy who ran the organization was placed on the Treasury Department's kingpins list. These are drug traffickers who the U.S. would designate kingpins and freeze their assets. The controversy that you mentioned is that the U.S. asked and was granted the right of extradition to extradite this guy and several of his workers to the United States to face charges. But they had an appeal before a court in Tanzania. And the attorney who represents them, and several people, in Tanzania too, accused the U.S. of just taking these guys before their appeal was actually heard. So they were extradited before their appeal was heard.
You also write about how the concern of a number of countries that Trump is exporting his travel ban. Explain.
Yeah, so that was something that actually came up in Ireland earlier this year in one of the pre-clearance facilities in Europe, where an Irish citizen was not allowed to board a plane to come to the U.S., and several lawmakers there accused the U.S. of basically using the pre-clearance facility to enforce the travel ban that the president had signed earlier in the year. And that's been an ongoing criticism, but it's even more so because of the administration's travel ban.
Ron, I want to ask about another article you wrote. During this busy travel season, it was this month, Senators Mike Lee, Republican, Ed Markey, Democrat, called for a halt to the expansion of a $1 billion airport facial scanning program that the Department of Homeland Security uses to identify travelers on some flights that depart from 9 U.S. airports: Boston, Las Vegas, Miami, New York's JFK, Washington Dulles, both Houston airports, Chicago O'Hare, and Atlanta. Congress Congress has approved the program for use on non-U.S. citizens, but never expressly authorized its use on Americans. In a letter to Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen, the senators asked for a, quote, explanation for why DHS believes it has the authority to proceed. The senators also asked DHS to provide data about the accuracy of the scans and cited a study by the Center on Privacy and Technology that you reported on, which said the technology has high error rates and is subject to bias because the scans often fail to properly identify women and African Americans. You cite Harrison Rudolph, an associate at the center and an author of the report, saying, quote, it's telling that DHS cannot identify a single benefit actually resulting from airport face scans at the departure gate. So explain what they are, what people who experience at some of these airports like JFK or the Houston airports.
So this program is something that has actually been law since 1996 when Congress authorized an entry-exit program. And it took on new meaning after 9/11 because two of the 9/11 hijackers overstayed their visa. So this program is to identify when people leave this country. There has been an issue with visa overstays, that people who come here and overstay their visa, and actually most of the people who are undocumented in the country now are actually people who overstayed their visas. But because of the 9/11 hijackers and potential threats that way, Congress has authorized this program to be able to track when people leave. So you get your visa, you come here, they track when you come, now they know that you're gone. So the issue that the center pointed out is that the facial scans that they use are also being used on Americans, and this was supposed to identify foreign nationals who are leaving to make sure that they, again, don't overstay their visas. The issue that CBP says, well, you can't separate out Americans from other people when they're getting on a plane, and you do want to verify that they are indeed Americans. But the information that, according to Customs and Border Protection, the information that they collect is used differently for Americans than it is for foreign nationals. They're saying that once they actually identify that you are American, then that's the end of it. They don't keep any additional data on you. But what the center says in the report that you referenced is that, well, Congress never authorized them to actually do facial scanning of American citizens. And there has not been any, they have not gone through a rulemaking process laying out what they do with this data, and that's the real issue there, that there has not been any rulemaking on this, so they don't know what CBP actually does with this information that they collect.
An executive order, you report, signed in January by President Trump calls for Homeland Security officials to speed up the deployment of the biometric systems at the airports. What rights do people have? And explain exactly what they look like, these biometric the system. Sure. Can they say no? Well,
so right now what CBP, Customs and Border Protection, says that you have the right to opt out, that you can actually say, well, I don't want to do this type of scan, and then they will just physically look at your documents and try and verify your identity another way. What the center is saying is that, well, that's not explicit, that they don't tell you that, hey, you can opt out. They simply put things on their website, or they will hand people these cards, but it's not explicit saying that you can't opt out. And in terms of what they look like, some of them are simply, it's a kiosk that is you walk up to, you put your documents down, it scans the documents, and it snaps a photo of you, and it matches it against information that CBP has of people on that flight. The other method is that there are handheld devices where CBP customs officers will stand there and gather biometrics. And some airlines who are partnering with them are building it into, so when you walk up to have your ticket scanned to get on the plane, it simply snaps a photo of you there and matches against the photos that CBP has to, again, authenticate who you are, because the CBP contention is that biometrics information can't be faked the way that physical paper documents can.
Ron Nixon, I want to thank you for being with us, New York Times Homeland Security correspondent based in Washington, D.C. We'll link to your pieces. Homeland Security Goes Abroad. Not everyone is grateful. As well as your piece, Facial Scans at U.S. Airports Violate Americans' Privacy, report says. When we come back, we'll play more of our interview with Emilio Gutierrez Soto. He's a Mexican journalist who's been jailed at a detention center in El Paso with his son, Oscar. He says if he's deported to Mexico, he will be killed. Then we will talk with the Committee to Protect Journalists about the number of journalists and media workers who've been killed and imprisoned around the world this year. Stay with us. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn now to an update on the case of Mexican journalist Emilio Gutierrez, who's fighting his deportation from a U.S. detention center in El Paso along with his son. Mexico is one of the most dangerous countries in the world for journalists, and Gutierrez and his son first sought asylum in the United States in 2008 after receiving death threats for reporting on alleged corruption in the Mexican military. They were detained for 7 months, eventually released to live in the United States while his asylum appeal was pending. They survived by operating a food truck in New Mexico until last July. But after nearly a decade, Gutierrez's asylum appeal was denied, and earlier this month, he was again detained. Well, this week, after a visit from Texas Democratic Congressmember Beto O'Rourke and a flurry of news reports, including here on Democracy Now!, the Board of Immigration Appeals reopened Gutierrez's asylum case and vacated his deportation order, granting him a full stay of his removal order. This means Gutierrez Soto cannot be deported at the moment, and that the BIA, the Bureau of Immigration Appeals, will now issue a new ruling. But Gutierrez has still not been released. Neither has his son. This is Emilio Gutierrez Soto speaking to us earlier this month in an exclusive jailhouse interview with Juan Gonzalez and me, directly from his El Paso detention center, talking about what he fears will happen if he's deported back to Mexico.
Well, if we are deported, that obviously implies death. Why? Because ICE, under the Department of Homeland Security of the United States, by law, must give a report to the immigration authorities of Mexico and the consulate. And the immigration officials in Mexico have no credibility. It's impossible to trust in them. To the contrary, many of those officials, many personnel at the consulate or immigration service are caught up with organized crime. And organized crime is precisely the Mexican government. If the government didn't give its consent for criminal groups to work with impunity, certainly the conditions would be different. But the government of Mexico facilitates the work of criminal groups who operate with total impunity. The government of Mexico, we all know, is the most corrupt government in the hemisphere and obviously enjoys no credibility. Now, the conditions we find ourselves at this ICE jail in El Paso are truly denigrating. We have seen, my son and myself, most of the immigrants detained here are from Central and South America, the majority. We're not so many Mexicans here at this jail. Now, given the extreme poverty, well, of course, that is experienced in Mexico, but even more so in Central and South America, for many of the persons detained, it seems that the conditions are adequate, are pleasant, but they are denigrating.
La comida es, aparte de pobre nutricionalmente,
the food is poor nutritionally.
No es de ninguna manera agradable consumir.
It is not pleasant at all to eat the food here. Not at all. Plus, the rations, the portions are too small.
And Emilio, the immigration authorities here in the United States are saying that you have no proof, no documentary proof of your claims, or that no witnesses have appeared to back up your claims. How do you respond to that?
Yo creo que las autoridades migratorias son una institución.
I believe that the immigration authorities are an institution based on lies. It would appear that I would need to enter the United States with bullet holes on the front and back of my body, or mutilated, which is what the institutional criminal group, the Mexican government, generally does.
So that's Emilio Gutierrez Soto speaking to us directly from a detention prison in Texas earlier this month. Since he received a full stay of deportation this week, his followers are calling for his release, arguing he poses no threat to security, is not a flight risk, and faces health problems the longer he's held. For more, we're going to go to El Paso first, by Democracy Now! Video stream, to Gutierrez's lawyer, Ed Beckett. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Eduardo Beckett. Talk about what happened this week. What is the decision that was made that would stop the deportation of Emilio Gutierrez, at least for now?
Good morning. Pleasure to be here. So this week, the Board of Immigration Appeals reinstated his appeal, vacated the deportation order, and basically what it means is that they're going to review his case again. They're going to allow us to file legal briefs and so he's going to be able to present his case to the Board of Immigration Appeals so they can either grant him the asylum, agree with the judge, or remand or send back the case to the judge to redo it. If the court thinks that there's irregularities or that the judge's decision was erroneous. So it's very good news for him, but bad news that he's detained and he's being treated like a criminal, in my opinion.
So this is Emilio Gutierrez Soto speaking in October in Washington, D.C., as he accepted the National Press Club's John Aubuchon Press Freedom Award on behalf of Mexico's journalists. He spoke alongside a translator.
The murder cases, the disappearances, and the exiles is a constant suffering and source of pain for our families.
Doña Impunidad no nos ha dejado de la mano.
Lady Impunity has not let go of our hand.
Mientras la justicia, Doña Justicia, se prostituye acompañada del Estado.
While Lady Justice prostitutes herself in the company of the government.
Los medios, perdón, para rematar la libertad de expresión,
to again kill the freedom of expression.
Quienes buscamos asilo político en países como este,
those who seek political asylum in countries like this, like the United States,
nos encontramos con la cerrazón de autoridades migratorias.
We encounter we encountered the decisions of immigration authorities
que regatean las leyes internacionales.
that barter away the international laws.
So that's Emilio Gutierrez receiving the Aubuchon National Press Freedom Award on behalf of Mexican journalists at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. So for more, I want to bring into the conversation from Washington, Bill McCarran, Executive Director of the National Press Club, which invited Emilio Gutierrez to accept that award. McCarran went to El Paso earlier last week to visit Gutierrez in detention. He also delivered to authorities boxes full of petitions that call for Gutierrez to be released. Bill McCarran, welcome to Democracy Now! Can you explain when you went to El Paso, your visit with both Emilio and Oscar, and then with ICE officials?
Sure. Hi, Amy. Thanks for having me. So we were able to go to El Paso and, through the work of Eddie Beckett, get into detention to see Emilio and Oscar. There were brief meetings. I was accompanied by Congressman Beto O'Rourke from the El Paso area and two of his staff. It was an emotional meeting with Emilio in particular. He was agitated. He broke down a couple of times. He complained of health problems, which you all have discussed earlier. And we think, by the way, the diet may contribute to high blood pressure. He said his arm was numb, this sort of thing. He wasn't sleeping well. And I'm not a doctor, but he seemed to be having PTS and those kind of symptoms. Is depressed. The authorities did not let us see Emilio and Oscar at the same time. Emilio had to exit the room, and then Oscar entered. Oscar seems healthy. He's very concerned about his father, of course, but in every way he presents almost like any early college-age kid you'd meet. Just a great kid, and it was an honor to see them, but it was upsetting to see them under those circumstances. And then we followed for a meeting with ICE officials, as you indicated.
You talk about how that meeting went, and did ICE officials tell you that you should be toning it down, and explain what they meant?
Sure. Well, I mean, as you mentioned, we were there to, among other things, present petitions, and we had, at that point, 18,000 signatures. I believe it's close to 23,000 now. And we were able to submit those into Emilio's case file. So that was very important action for us. And we did not know we would be able to meet with ICE. So during the meeting, there were 5 ICE officials, and myself, the congressman, and his staff, and Eduardo, Emilio's attorney. And during the meeting, we were discussing the judge's case, his ruling, and the judge found that Emilio didn't present credible evidence, in his view, about his journalistic activities, and did not suggest that he would be, did not give adequate reason that he would be in danger if he returned to Mexico, both of which we object. So we were discussing this, and we were told by one of the ICE officials that we should tone it down. And I think by that he meant, take a calmer approach to this. Don't question things as much. He said, let the process work. Well, my answer to him immediately was, we were not there to tone it down. We were there to raise the issue of Emilio's case and make sure everyone knew his name, if possible, and make sure everybody knew the circumstances, that this was a journalist seeking asylum, and it was not being granted asylum. And we know that the ICE officials knew that we would have a news conference at 1 o'clock that day. So this was a bit of a shot across the bow. Now, later they chose in the press to deny that they had said we should tone it down, or suggested that wasn't what they meant. But we were pretty clear what they meant.
Mm. Why is this case so important to you, Bill, as executive director of the National Press Club? And also, why is Emilio Gutierrez and his son Oscar still being held in jail?
Well, that last question, honestly, my answer is I do not know. As Eduardo mentioned, they are, they have no criminal record. They're not a threat to the community. The facility is very crowded. We believe as many as 30 people were released to humanitarian parole the week prior. So there are a lot of people that may need to be in that facility. We don't think Emilio and Oscar are two of them, and we're asking that they be released. Why we gave Emilio the Aubuchon Award and why we were interested in putting a spotlight on problems in Mexico related to journalism in general, I would call your viewers' attention to a recent report by the United Nations that came out December 4th, in which David Kaye, who's a very credible person, and some of his staff went through Mexico for a week, interviewed 250 journalists about the kinds of problems that are going on there. And just a few quick facts. We believe there have been 12 journalists this year killed in Mexico. None of those 12 cases have been solved. And some of those journalists who have been killed are in a protection program that's operated by the Mexican government. And it's that very program cited by the judge that he says will protect Emilio Gutierrez if he's returned to Mexico. We're not buying that. We don't think it's an effective program. We're very concerned about violence against journalists everywhere, but in Mexico. And so Emilio is a great case for us to highlight. It's an unfortunate case, but it's one we want to bring full attention to. And we're the National Press Club is the world's leading professional organization for journalists. So this is what we do. And we do it in Iran and Azerbaijan and other places, but I never thought we'd be having to fight a case like this here in the United States.
Eduardo Becket, can you explain why at this point, with the case going to the Bureau of Immigration Appeals, Emilio is still being held? He has not committed a crime, nor has his son.
Yes, and Amy, I think that we're seeing the criminalization of asylum seekers, where the Department of Homeland Security, ICE, is taking the position that if you come and enter illegally, like Emilio and his son did, through one of our land port of entries and seek asylum, that you should be treated like a criminal. There's no good reason to hold him. He meets all the criteria to be released. I think that going back to the question that you asked about the media, I believe that, with all due respect, that Immigration Customs Enforcement is a bipolar organization. On the one hand, to my face, they'd say, we don't care about the media. We don't care if you go to the media. On the other hand, privately, they say, tone it down. And so this is a bipolar organization that wants to treat legitimate asylum persons like Emilio like criminals. And Congress has given them so much power. It's kind of like if the police charges you with a crime, but you never get to see the judge, and only the police gets to decide when and how they're going to release you. Same thing with ICE. Since he entered legally, the law that Congress gave this power to ICE, basically they decide if they wanted to release him. They can release him on his own recognizance, on an order of supervision. They can set a bond, a low bond. They can put an alternative to detention programs. So they have a whole host of tools that they can use, but they're choosing not to. And so we're shocked that Congress gave them so much unfettered discretion. And I think that's a bigger issue that I think Congress needs to fix this, because then it's abuse of authority.
So they could release him today.
Exactly. They can release him right now if they want to.
Oh, the BIA stands for the Board of Immigration Appeals. Bill McCarran, also the fact that Emilio Gutierrez is a journalist who was reporting on narco-trafficking, its relationship with the Mexican government, with President Trump's professed concern about the drug war and narco-traffickers, you would think that journalists like Emilio are critical.
You would think so. There's plenty of need for good journalism in Mexico, so Emilio's voice and his outspoken approach to problems in Mexico, whether he's here or in Mexico, is valuable, and I think should be encouraged. We do think it's a dangerous place for him now, and we think he should not be returned, and we would think that the United States policy should be all about trying to protect him. I wanted to point out, Amy, that the Washington Post, in a December 12th editorial called for asylum for Emilio. So when the judge is questioning whether or not Emilio is a journalist, well, we're giving him an award. The Washington Post is calling for asylum for him. I really don't think it's a question about whether or not he's a journalist and whether his voice is a valuable one.
Well, I want to thank you for being with us. Of course, we'll continue to follow this case. And if you want to see, watch, listen to, read our full interview with Emilio Gutierrez Soto in jail in El Paso, the interview that Juan Gonzalez and I did, you can go to democracynow.org. Bill McCarran, thanks for being with us, Executive Director of the National Press Club, and Eduardo Beckett, Emilio's attorney. Thanks so much for being with us. When we come back, the Committee to Protect Journalists has come out with a report on imprisoned and detained journalists around the world. It's chilling. Stay with us.
Va pasando el trapo sobre la mesa y está cuidando que todo brille como una perla. Cuando llegue la patrona, que no se vuelva a quejar, no sea cosa que la acuse de ilegal.
El Hielo, or ICE, Immigration Custom Enforcement, La Santa Cecilia, performing in our Democracy Now! Studio. To see the interviews and the performances, you can go to democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. We end today's show with the 25th annual survey from the Committee to Protect Journalists of journalists killed and jailed around the world. This year, the list of those killed includes 46 journalists and media workers, some covering wars, others murdered in retaliation for their reporting, another 20 killed in circumstances CPJ cannot confirm or related to their work, a record 262 journalists imprisoned around the world, with Turkey, China, and Egypt topping the list for the second year in a row. Few, if any, of the murders are solved. This comes as President Trump has waged a relentless campaign to discredit journalists in the United States, often with rhetoric that could potentially incite his followers to violence. For more, we're joined by Maria Salazar-Fedo, who is the director of the Committee to Protect Journalists Emergencies Department. Maria, welcome to Democracy Now! Talk about what you found. And also, coming out of this interview around Emilio Gutierrez, the journalist imprisoned in a U.S. jail, can you talk about the dangers Mexican journalists face?
Absolutely. There was a record number of journalists imprisoned this year, 262, as you said, around the world. The top 3 jailers of journalists account for more than half of those journalists, and about 3/4 of journalists imprisoned around the world are behind bars on anti-state charges, such as terrorism. Interestingly, we noted this year that there was a spike in charges of false news in countries, again, in some of the top countries like Turkey, China, and Egypt.
In those 3 top countries, Egypt, China, Turkey, when you talk about, you're talking about fake news, this something that President Trump has been pushing around the United States, charging the media with putting it out.
Exactly. Last year we had documented 9 cases. This year we documented 21 around the world on this charge. And, you know, we're talking about authoritarian governments, but they are holding on to any kind of reason to imprison journalists, and this kind of rhetoric coming out of President Trump and can embolden them in terms of jailing journalists who are critical of their governments.
In May, award-winning Mexican reporter Javier Valdez was assassinated, dragged out of his car, shot 12 times, less than a block from his office. The killing of Valdez sparked widespread outrage across Mexico. Multiple Mexican digital media outlets went on a 24-hour strike, refusing to publish anything but a black banner with the names of the journalists assassinated in Mexico at the time. This is a clip of Valdez's 2011 speech when he came here to New York to receive the International Press Freedom Award from the Committee to Protect Journalists.
I have been a journalist these past 21 years, and never before have I suffered or enjoyed it this intensely, nor with so many dangers.
En Culiacán, Sinaloa, Mexico.
In Culiacan, in the state of Sinaloa, Mexico, it is dangerous to be alive, and to do journalism is to tread an invisible line drawn by the bad guys, who are in drug trafficking and in the government, in a field strewn with explosives. This is what most of the country is living through. One must protect oneself from everything and everyone, and there do not seem to be options or salvation, and often there is no one to turn to.
That's the award-winning Mexican reporter Javier Valdez. In May, he was gunned down. Maria.
This was a particularly brutal killing and one that touched us personally. As you just saw, Javier was he received our award, but he was a personal friend of a lot of CPJ staff, and it was just heartbreaking. I had personally been in touch with him right before this happened. And I think Javier's case really shows the degree to which Mexican journalists are vulnerable. I mean, this guy was a renowned investigative journalist, and he really thought that his work and his position kind of protected him, but it didn't. His reporting put him in more danger, and there was not enough done to protect him. He was one of 6 journalists we documented having been targeted in Mexico this year. Mexico is interesting because we noted a decrease in the targeting of journalists, the direct targeting of journalists in retaliation for their work this year. But around the world, we saw a decrease, not so in Mexico. In Mexico, it continued to happen.
Burma. 2 Reuters reporters just detained who could face up to 14 years in prison for allegedly violating the country's Official Secrets Act.
That's right. That's a colonial law that is still in the books. They were reporting on the Rohingya crisis and are being accused of having illegally obtained information from police. They face up to 14 years in prison, and like most of what we're seeing around the world, they're being punished and silenced for reporting on something critical.
What about the impunity governments feel? What happens to governments where journalists are killed? What do governments do in Turkey, in China? I mean, these are the governments that are imprisoning them.
Right. So there's China, Turkey, Egypt that are imprisoning journalists, but there's also, that's one problem. Then there's a second really large problem around the world in terms of being able to do your work as a journalist, and that's impunity in killings of journalists. That's a problem that we've seen in Mexico continue throughout the last decade. When a government does not punish, does not go after the killers of journalists, this just emboldens more attacks and more killings of journalists.
What are you calling for at CPJ?
In terms of impunity? We're calling the international community to shed a light on this, and we're calling on governments like the government of Mexico to investigate and punish those who are killing journalists.
And overall, these 2 reports, one on arrests, one on killings, what do you overall hope to accomplish?
We really think that the international community and international pressure is one of the best weapons we have to protect journalists. We are calling on the international community to pressure governments like the Turkish government, like the Chinese government, to release journalists, and to call on Mexican authorities to investigate and protect journalists who are doing their job.
I want to thank you so much for being with us, Maria Salazar-Ferro, Director of the Committee to Protect Journalists Emergencies Department. And that does it for our show, Democracy Now! Now accepting applications for our paid year-long news fellowship. Details at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Produced by Renee Feldstein, Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gaddisdiner, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Amy Goodman. Have a happy New Year. year and good news next year.